The rain didn't just fall, it assaulted the windows of St. Michael's Hospital, each drop a tiny fist drumming against the glass. Inside the emergency room, the storm was a distant, muted roar, drowned out by a cacophony of controlled chaos. Beeping monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, and the clipped, precise language of urgency. This was Sarah Jenkins's world. At 32, she moved through the bedlam with an unhurried grace that belied the frantic pace of her thoughts. She was the trauma bay's anchor, the calm eye in a hurricane of human suffering. Tonight, the hurricane was about to make landfall. The wail of an approaching siren grew from a faint cry to a gut-shaking scream. The bay doors flew open, admitting a blast of wind and water and two paramedics wrestling with a gurney. On it, a man lay broken. "John Doe," the first paramedic yelled, his voice ragged. "Single occupant MVA, we think. Found him off Route 7. Car was wrapped around a tree. GCS of 5, hypotensive, tachycardic. We've pushed 2 liters of saline and his pressure is still in the toilet." Sarah's eyes did a practiced, instantaneous scan. The man was huge, with the kind of dense, coiled muscle that didn't come from a gym but from a life of rigorous, functional strength. He was covered in blood and mud, his clothes shredded. But it wasn't a car accident. The deep, penetrating shrapnel wounds in his abdomen and thigh weren't from a dashboard. The precise, clean laceration on his arm wasn't from shattered glass. This was something else. "Get him in Trauma 1, she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. "Page Dr. Evans. I want a full trauma panel, CBC. Type and cross, and get the portable X-ray in here now. Let's move." The team swarmed, a blur of blue scrubs and focused energy. They cut away what was left of his clothes, exposing a landscape of brutal injury. As they worked, Sarah noticed a small, faded tattoo on his inner forearm, a specter with a single glowing eye. Military. Special Forces, by the look of it. It explained the unmarked black ambulance that had followed the paramedics in, its occupants 2 grim-faced men in dark suits who now stood silently in the corner of the bay, watching. "Pressure's dropping, 80/40, a junior nurse, Maria, called out. "Hang another 2 units of Oneg," Sarah ordered. "Let's get that chest tube in." Dr. Evans, a harried man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, arrived and began barking orders. They worked in a frantic, synchronized rhythm, a ballet of life-saving interventions, but the patient was losing blood faster than they could replace it. The call came from the lab 10 minutes later, delivered by a breathless technician. "We have a problem," he said, holding up a printout. "A big one." Sarah took the paper. Her eyes scanned the results, and a cold knot formed in her stomach. "Oh, negative," she muttered, reading aloud for the team. "We knew that, but he's Duffy, negative, and Kell, negative with an anti-JCA antibody. God, this is 1 in a million." Dr. Evans paled. "What does the blood bank have?" The tech shook his head. "Nothing. Not a single bag. We ran it twice. Regional bank in the city is the closest match, but they'd have to fly it in. Best case, 90 minutes. Realistically, 2 hours." A funereal silence fell over the trauma bay, broken only by the frantic, high-pitched alarm of the patient's monitor. His blood pressure was now 60/30 and still falling. "He doesn't have 2 hours, Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "He doesn't have 10 minutes. Sarah stared at the dying man on the table. He was a ghost, a nameless soldier who had ended up on her table, in her care. In her mind, she could see the life draining out of him, his heartbeat a weakening drumbeat counting down his final seconds. She looked at the blood type on the paper again, the rare combination of antigens and antibodies, and she felt a dizzying, electric shock of recognition. It was a mirror. It was her own blood type. She had found out after a donation drive in college, a medical curiosity the phlebotomist had made a fuss over. "You're a true universal donor," the woman had told her, "but you're a nightmare to find a match for. Don't get in any bad accidents." Now, a bad accident was lying on her table. Her floor supervisor, David Chen, a man who saw the world as a series of checkboxes and protocols, saw the look on her face. "Don't even think about it, Jenkins," he warned, his voice low and sharp. "Directed donations are against every policy we have. Staff donation on duty? That's not just a firing offense, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. It's an unacceptable risk." Sarah's gaze flickered from David's stern face to the monitor, where the patient's heart rate was becoming erratic. The machine was screaming that he was about to die. Protocol, policy, liability, the words were meaningless static, All she could hear was the oath she had taken, a silent promise that echoed in her heart. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. And letting a man die when she had the means to save him felt like the greatest harm of all. "He's going into V-fib," Dr. Evans shouted. "Paddles!" They shocked him. The body on the table jumped, a gruesome, marionette-like dance. A weak rhythm returned, but it wouldn't hold, not without blood. Sarah looked David Chen dead in the eye. Her voice was quiet, but it rang with the clarity of a bell in the silent room. "My book says I save his life." She turned to Maria. "Get a 16-gauge 4 kit and a blood bag." "Now." Maria froze, her eyes wide, darting between Sarah and the furious supervisor. "Did you hear me?" Sarah's voice was harder now, imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with job titles. "Move." Maria, jolted into action, scurried to a supply cart. "I am ordering you to stop, Jenkins." David's voice rose, cracking with disbelief and rage. "This will be your job. Your license." Sarah ignored him. She strode to the other side of the gurney, opposite the dying soldier. She grabbed a tourniquet and expertly wrapped it around her own bicep, her movements swift and sure. As Maria returned with the kit, Sarah took the large bore needle. She found the vein in her own arm, the one she had used to save countless others, and without a moment's hesitation, she slid the needle in. Dark, life-giving blood began to flow from her arm into the clear bag. The two men in suits, who had been silent observers, now stepped forward. Their faces a mixture of shock and something else awe. "Hang it," Sarah said to Maria, her voice a little weaker. "Wide open now." The bag filled quickly. Maria, her hands shaking, connected the line to the patient's central line. The room watched, mesmerized, as Sarah's own blood, a perfect, impossible match, began to flow into the John Doe. The monitor, which had been sounding a death knell, began to change its tune. The frantic beeping slowed, becoming more regular. The blood pressure, which had been bottoming out, ticked upward, 70/40, then 80/50. Sarah stood tethered to the man, a living lifeline. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the gurney's rail to steady herself. She could feel the life draining from her, but she could see it returning to him. It was a terrifying, exhilarating exchange. She had broken the rules, shattered protocol, and likely torched her career. But on the monitor, a steady, life-affirming rhythm pulsed on, and for the first time that night, Sarah Jenkins knew the man on her table was going to live. The morning light was a pale, watery gray, filtering through the blinds of Sarah's small apartment. It did little to cut through the pounding in her head. She sat at her kitchen table, nursing a mug of black coffee and a glass of orange juice, trying to replenish the iron and sugar her body was screaming for. Her arm ached, a deep, phantom throb from where the needle had been. Every pulse was a reminder of the night before. After they had stabilized him, the men in suits had moved with quiet, terrifying efficiency. The John Doe, now Sergeant Michael Vance, according to the quiet words exchanged between the suits and a tight-lipped Dr. Evans, was transferred out before the sun rose. A military medical team had arrived, collected him, and vanished into the pre-dawn darkness. The hospital administration had been clear. She was to go home, rest, and speak to no one about the incident until she was contacted. The silence was more unnerving than a reprimand. She replayed the events in her mind for the 100th time. The desperate gamble, the look on David Chen's face, a cocktail of fury and fear, the slow, miraculous rise of the numbers on the monitor. Had she done the right thing? Every fiber of her being, every instinct she had honed over a decade in the crucible of the ER, screamed yes. But a colder, more practical part of her brain whispered that her career was balanced on a knife's edge. She had saved a man, but she had defied a system, and systems had long memories and sharp teeth. She was just lifting the coffee mug to her lips when the knock came. It wasn't the tentative rap of a delivery person or the familiar rhythm of a neighbor. This was a sharp, percussive sound. 3 distinct, authoritative knocks that echoed through her small apartment, vibrating with a purpose that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She put the mug down, her hand steady despite the sudden lurch in her stomach. She walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Her blood ran cold. Standing on her welcome mat was a man who seemed to have been carved from granite. He was tall, ramrod straight, with silver hair cut in a severe military style. The uniform he wore was immaculate, a deep green adorned with an intimidating array of ribbons and stars on the shoulder. A general. Flanking him, standing a half step back, were two military police officers in crisp uniforms, their faces impassive, their hands resting near the holsters on their belts. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was so much bigger than a hospital reprimand. She took a deep, steadying breath and opened the door. "Sarah Jenkins?" the general asked. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of warmth or inflection. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. "Yes," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. I am General Marcus Thorne," he stated, his eyes, a piercing shade of blue, boring into hers. They didn't blink. "May we come in?" Again, it wasn't a request. Numbly, she stepped aside, holding the door open. The three men entered, their presence instantly shrinking her cozy living room, their polished boots silent on her worn wooden floors. The MPs took up positions on either side of the door, their posture rigid, their eyes scanning the room as if assessing for threats. General Thorne stood in the center of the room, a pillar of unassailable authority. "Please, have a seat," she offered, gesturing towards her small sofa. "I prefer to stand," he said curtly. He waited for her to sit, a subtle power play that put her immediately on the defensive. She remained standing, clutching her hands together to keep them from shaking. He began without preamble. "I'm here regarding the events of last night at St. Michael's Hospital, specifically your interaction with a patient under our care." "I was just doing my job," Sarah said, finding a sliver of her voice. "He was dying." A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, crossed the general's face. "Your job," he said, the words dripping with condescension, "is to follow the procedures and protocols of your institution. What you did was not your job. What you did was take an unauthorized, reckless, and frankly sentimental action that has created a situation of extreme complexity." Sarah stared at him, stunned. She had expected a reprimand, perhaps even a grudging thank you wrapped in a lecture. She had not expected to be addressed like a criminal. "The man you treated," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial chilling level, "is not a civilian. He is Sergeant First Class Michael Vance, a critical national security asset. His skills, his training, his very physiology are matters of state interest. His operational history is classified above top secret." He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "And you, a civilian nurse with an unvetted background, decided to introduce your own biological material directly into his system. You took $1 billion asset and contaminated him." The word contaminated hit her like a slap. "I saved his life," she insisted, her voice rising with indignation. "He had a rare blood type. I was the only match. He would be dead right now if I hadn't. That outcome may have been preferable to the current situation," Thorne said, his voice as cold as a morgue slab. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of his statement stole her breath. He wasn't just angry. He believed what he was saying. In his world of assets and threats, the messy, unpredictable humanity of a single nurse was a greater danger than death itself. "We now have a breach," he went on, pacing slowly in front of her. "We don't know you. We don't know your medical history beyond a cursory file. We don't know your associations. For all we know, you could be a foreign agent who saw an opportunity. Or worse, a well-meaning fool who has compromised years of security protocols. Your blood is now part of him. Your DNA is in a classified weapon. Do you have any idea, any concept at all, of the mess you have created for us?" Each word was a calculated blow, designed to belittle, to intimidate, to crush her. He wasn't there to understand. He was there to assert control. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and burgeoning anger. "I took an oath to help people. I saw a person dying and I helped him." "You saw a piece on a chessboard you did not understand and decided to move it," he countered instantly. "From this moment, you will not speak of this to anyone. Not your friends, not your family, not your colleagues. A joint investigation is being launched by my office and your hospital's administration. You will make yourself available for questioning by my officers and by local law enforcement. You will provide them with a full, unredacted medical history and a list of all recent personal contacts. Is that understood?" She could only nod, her throat tight. He walked to the door, pausing before he left. He turned his head, fixing her with one last, glacial stare. "You think you're a hero, Miss Jenkins. But heroes understand the bigger picture. They understand that sometimes, for the greater good, sacrifices must be made." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. Then he added the final, chilling verdict. "You should have let him die." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Sarah alone in the sudden, deafening silence of her apartment. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside her was just beginning to rage. The summons came via a cold, impersonal email the next morning. Mandatory meeting regarding your employment status. 1,400 hours. Administration Wing. Conference Room 3. There was no please, no we hope you're feeling well. It was a command, a prelude to an execution. Sarah spent the hours before the meeting in a state of anxious limbo, her apartment feeling more like a cage. General Thorne's words echoed in her mind, twisting her act of saving a life into one of sabotage and contamination. She dressed with deliberate care, choosing a simple, professional blouse and slacks, a silent armor against the onslaught she knew was coming. The administration wing of Street Michaels was a world away from the controlled chaos of the ER. Here, the air was still and smelled of floor polish and stale coffee. The silence was thick, broken only by the quiet hum of computers. When she entered Conference Room 3, the scene was worse than she had imagined. Dr. Alistair Finch, the hospital administrator, sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. He was a small man with thinning hair and a perpetually worried expression, but today his face was a mask of pinched fury. Beside him sat the hospital's lawyer, a woman with a severe haircut and an expression to match. And across from them, looking deeply uncomfortable, was her former supervisor, David Chen. "Sarah," Dr. Finch began, dispensing with any pretense of courtesy. "Sit." She sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. Finch slapped a thick folder down on the table. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. "Do you have any idea at all of the magnitude of the disaster you have caused?" he hissed, leaning forward. His voice was a low, venomous whisper. "I saved a man's life, Dr. Finch," Sarah replied, keeping her own voice steady. "You exposed this hospital to catastrophic liability." Finch shot back, his volume rising. "You violated at least a dozen state and federal regulations? You broke every conceivable patient care protocol this hospital has spent millions of dollars to implement. We have the Pentagon breathing down our necks, questioning our security, our competence, our very right to operate." He was practically vibrating with rage. "Who do you think you are? Do they hand out security clearances with nursing degrees now? You went rogue, Jenkins. You played God with a man who, it turns out, is more important than you could possibly imagine, and in doing so, you have jeopardized the careers of everyone in this room and the federal funding this hospital depends on to survive." The hospital's lawyer cleared her throat. "What Dr. Finch means to say," she said in a dry, emotionless tone, "is that your actions constituted a gross violation of hospital policy. You performed an unauthorized medical procedure on a patient, using unscreened biological material your own, thereby breaking the chain of custody and nullifying the hospital's liability insurance for this specific case." "She's right," David Chen mumbled, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes. "I told her not to. I ordered her to stand down. She was insubordinate." Sarah felt a surge of betrayal so sharp it was like a physical pain. She looked at David, the man she had worked alongside for 5 years, who had just thrown her under the bus to save himself. "He was dying, David," she said, her voice quiet. "You saw the monitor. We had no blood." "We had a protocol," David retorted, his gaze fixed on the table. "The protocol is there to protect the patient, the staff, and the hospital. You chose to ignore it." "The protocol was going to kill him. That is not for you to decide," Finch roared, slamming his hand on the table. "Your job is to follow the rules. Effective immediately, you are suspended indefinitely without pay, pending a full investigation. You are not to set foot on hospital property unless requested. You are not to contact any hospital staff. We will be confiscating your ID and your locker key. Is that understood?" Sarah felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Suspended. Indefinitely. It was a professional death sentence. She nodded numbly, the fight draining out of her. Her day was not over. As she was being escorted out of the building by a security guard, a humiliating walk of shame past the curious eyes of her former colleagues, she was met at the exit by 2 police detectives. "Miss Jenkins?" one of them asked, a large man with a weary face. "I'm Detective Miller. This is Detective Sanchez. We need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement." The interview room was small, gray, and smelled of disinfectant. They sat her down at a metal table, a tape recorder sitting between them. The tone was professional, but the questions were insidious, circling the same points General Thorne had made. "So, you just happen to have this incredibly rare blood type?" Miller asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Yes. And you never felt compelled to register with any national rare donor databases?" Sanchez followed up. I donated in college. I knew it was rare. I didn't think much of it. Tell us about your personal life, Miss Jenkins, Miller said, changing tack. Any travel outside the U.S. in the last 5 years? Any friends or family living abroad? No, she said, confused. Why? Just routine, Sanchez said smoothly. We have to build a complete picture. Do you belong to any political organizations? Activist groups? It dawned on her with sickening clarity. They weren't investigating an ethics violation. They were vetting her. They were treating her like a potential spy, a security threat who had somehow managed to infiltrate the bloodstream of a secret soldier. The absurdity of it was staggering. She had spent her life caring for people, and now she was being interrogated as if she were a terrorist. I'm a nurse, she said, her voice hollow. That's it. I patch people up. I don't have a political agenda. After 2 hours of this circular, frustrating questioning, they let her go, but not before taking her fingerprints for elimination purposes. She walked out of the police station into the late afternoon sun, feeling utterly alone. In the space of 48 hours, she had been transformed from a dedicated caregiver into a pariah. Her career was in ruins, her reputation was shattered, and she was now a person of interest in a national security investigation. The system she had dedicated her life to had turned on her, its bureaucratic teeth sinking deep into her flesh. She had saved a man's life, and in return, her own was being systematically dismantled. The rage began to build in her chest, a slow, burning fire against the cold injustice of it all. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of silence and anxiety. Sarah's apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The phone never rang, except for robocalls. Her colleagues, people she had considered friends, were suddenly ghosts. She saw a few of them at the grocery store. They offered tight, awkward smiles before quickly finding another aisle. She was radioactive, and no one wanted to risk the fallout. The suspension without pay was a slow strangulation. She watched her meager savings account dwindle with every bill. She started eating pasta for every meal, turning the heat down to save on electricity. The isolation was the worst part. It was a heavy blanket that smothered her, leaving her alone with the echoing accusations of Thorne and Finch, contaminated, reckless, liable. For the first time in her life, she began to doubt her own instincts. Had she been arrogant? Had she let a hero complex override her professional judgment? The general's words haunted her sleepless nights. You should have let him die. The thought made her feel sick, but the system's monolithic certainty was beginning to erode her own. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just a fool who didn't understand the bigger picture. Her lowest point came a week into her suspension. A certified letter arrived from the hospital's legal department. It was dense with incomprehensible legalese, but the message was brutally clear. They were formally notifying her that she could be held personally and financially liable for any and all damages resulting from her willful breach of established medical protocols. They were threatening to sue her into oblivion to make her pay for the trouble she had caused. She dropped the letter on her coffee table and sank onto the sofa, the fight completely gone from her. They were going to ruin her. They would take her house, her license, everything she had ever worked for. All for an act of compassion. She curled into a ball, pulling a throw blanket over her head, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she cried. She wept for her lost career, for her isolation, and for the crushing weight of a world that punished kindness. It was in this moment of absolute despair that her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Her first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was another lawyer or investigator. But something made her answer. Is this Sarah Jenkins? A young, energetic voice asked. Who is this? Sarah replied, her voice thick from crying. My name is Ben Carter. I'm a reporter with the Alexandria Chronicle, he said quickly. Sorry to call you out of the blue, but I got a tip about what happened at Street Michaels last week. An anonymous source said you saved a soldier's life, and the hospital suspended you for it. I wanted to hear your side of the story. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. General Thorne's warning about speaking to no one rang in her ears. This could make everything so much worse. I can't talk about that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Look, I know you're in a tough spot, Ben said, his voice softening with empathy. But right now they control the narrative. The hospital, the military, they're painting you as reckless. If you don't speak up, that's the only story anyone will ever hear. A source told me you were a hero. People deserve to know the truth. She was about to hang up, to retreat back into her misery, But his words snagged on her conscience. The only story anyone will ever hear. He was right. They were erasing her, defining her by her violation, not her intent. Still, fear held her captive. "I have to go," she said, and ended the call. But the seed was planted. For the next 2 days, she paced her apartment, Ben Carter's words replaying in her mind. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday evening. It was another unknown number, this one from a different area code. She almost let it go to voicemail, but answered at the last second. "Hello? Is this Nurse Sarah Jenkins?" a woman's voice asked. It was soft, trembling with emotion. "Yes, at Island." There was a choked sob on the other end of the line. "Oh, thank God. My name is Elena Vance. I'm Michael's wife. The man you saved." Sarah sank onto the edge of her bed, her hand gripping the phone. "How is he?" she breathed. "He's alive," Elena said, her voice thick with tears. "He's still in the ICU, and it's a long road. But he's alive, because of you. I had to find you. A chaplain at the base hospital was very kind. He bent a few rules for me. He said you were in some kind of trouble because of what you did." The dam of Sarah's composure broke. The raw, unfiltered gratitude in this woman's voice was the one thing she hadn't known she needed. "They wouldn't tell me anything at first," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "Just that there was an incident, a complication during treatment. They make it sound so sterile. They don't tell you that a woman with the right blood and a brave heart broke their rules to keep your husband's heart beating. You didn't just save a soldier, Nurse Jenkins. You saved my husband. You saved a father. Our 2 little girls. They're going to have their daddy back because of you." Sarah listened, tears streaming down her face, but these were not tears of despair. They were tears of validation, of relief. Elena's words were a cleansing fire, burning away the bureaucratic jargon and the cold accusations. Contaminated asset. Legal liability. No. He was Michael. He was a husband. He was a father. In that moment, everything became clear. The fear that had paralyzed her evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She had done the right thing, and she would not let them bury her for it. "Elena," Sarah said, her own voice now steady and clear, "thank you. You have no idea what your call means to me." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the quiet of her room for a long time. The system wasn't just faceless, it was heartless. It saw soldiers as assets and nurses as liabilities. It saw rules, not people, and it was wrong. They had pushed her, threatened her, and isolated her. They had made a grave mistake. They had left her with nothing to lose. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her recent calls until she found the number for Ben Carter, the reporter. She took a deep breath and pressed the call button. When he answered, she didn't hesitate. "Ben," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "This is Sarah Jenkins. I'm ready to tell you my story." Ben Carter's article was a bombshell, titled "Nurse Who Saved Secret Soldier's Life Suspended and Threatened by Hospital." It went viral overnight. It was picked up by national news outlets, cable news channels, and social media influencers. The story was a perfect storm of human interest. A compassionate nurse, a heroic soldier, and a faceless, heartless bureaucracy. "Stand with" Sarah started trending on Twitter. A GoFundMe set up by Ben to cover her legal fees exploded past its goal in under 12 hours. The hospital and the military were caught completely flat-footed. Street Michaels was inundated with angry calls and emails. General Thorne's office issued a tight-lipped no comment, which only fueled the public's outrage. The PR nightmare forced the hospital's hand. They couldn't quietly fire her anymore. They had to be seen as fair. They scheduled a formal review board hearing to decide the fate of her employment and her nursing license. It was a kangaroo court, Sarah knew, designed to give the appearance of due process before delivering a predetermined verdict. But now, the whole world was watching. The hearing room was as sterile and intimidating as she'd imagined. The air was cold. At a long table sat the 5 board members, 3 senior doctors and 2 administrators, their faces grim. Dr. Alistair Finch sat with them, a stack of papers in front of him, his expression one of smug vindication. The hospital's lawyer was at his side. In the back of the room, a silent, imposing figure watched from the shadows. General Marcus Thorne. He wasn't officially part of the hearing, but his presence was a clear message, a weight pressing down on the entire proceeding. Sarah sat alone at a small table opposite them. She had declined a lawyer, against Ben's advice. This wasn't a battle of legal precedents, it was a battle of principles. She had to speak for herself. The hospital's lawyer, Miss Albright, began, laying out the case against Sarah with cold, dispassionate precision. "The facts are not in dispute," she began. "On the night of September 9th, Nurse Sarah Jenkins, in direct violation of established hospital policy and a direct order from her supervisor, performed an unauthorized directed blood donation on a patient. This act, while perhaps well-intentioned, constituted a flagrant disregard for the safety protocols that govern every accredited medical facility in this country." She droned on, citing bylaws and health codes. Dr. Finch chimed in, his voice dripping with false concern. "We simply cannot have staff members making unilateral, emotional decisions that expose patients and the institution to unknown risks. What if Miss Jenkins had an undetected pathogen in her blood? What if she had fainted from blood loss and injured herself, creating another medical emergency? Her actions were, in a word, unprofessional. They built their case brick by brick, a wall of logic devoid of humanity. They spoke of chain of custody, unvetted biologicals, and reckless endangerment. They framed her as a dangerous rogue, a liability that needed to be neutralized. When they were finished, the head of the board, a stern-looking surgeon named Dr. Wallace, turned to her. "Miss Jenkins, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah stood up, her heart pounding but her hands steady on the table in front of her. She looked at each board member, then at Dr. Finch, and finally let her gaze rest for a moment on General Thorne in the back. "I don't have a defense," she said, her voice clear and strong, filling the silent room, "because I don't believe my actions were wrong." She took a breath. "You've spent the last 20 minutes talking about protocols, policies, and liabilities. You've used a lot of sterile, legalistic words to describe what happened that night. So let me be clear about the reality of the situation." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with Dr. Wallace's. "There was a man on a table in my ER. His heart was failing. His body was riddled with shrapnel. And he was bleeding out so fast that we were measuring his life in minutes. We had no blood for him. The blood bank was empty. The regional supply was hours away. The protocol you value so highly had failed him. The only option your rulebook offered was to stand there and watch him die." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You speak of risks. The only certain outcome that night was his death. My action was the only variable that could change that. You call my decision emotional. I call it a medical diagnosis. I diagnosed a fatal problem and implemented the only available solution." Her voice began to rise, filled with the passion she had suppressed for weeks. "I took an oath. An oath that I see now is very different from the vows of administration and liability you all seem to have taken. My oath wasn't to a hospital binder or an insurance policy. It was to the patient in front of me. On that table, I didn't see a national security asset or a legal liability. I saw a human being, a man whose blood was spilling onto the floor of my trauma bay, and the only thing in the world that could save him was flowing through my own veins." She pushed herself away from the table, standing tall and straight. "My choice was simple. Do I follow a rule that guarantees a man's death, or do I honor the oath I swore to preserve his life? I chose the oath. I chose the human being. I would do it again tomorrow, and I would do it every day of the week." She looked directly at Dr. Finch, her eyes blazing. "If honoring that oath costs me my career, if it means I can no longer be a nurse in this hospital, then so be it. It just means I was in the wrong career to begin with. I am a nurse. I save lives. That is what I do. It is who I am." She finished, her chest heaving slightly, the silence in the room absolute. The board members stared at her, their professional masks unreadable. Dr. Finch looked apoplectic, his face flushed a deep red, but it was the man in the back of the room who captured her attention. For the briefest of moments, before he turned and slipped out of the room, Sarah saw an unmistakable flicker in General Thorne's icy blue eyes. It wasn't approval. It wasn't sympathy. It was something far more surprising. A crack in the granite. A flicker of respect. The board's decision came 2 days later. The public pressure, fueled by the ongoing media storm, had become an undeniable force. They couldn't fire her. Not now. The verdict was a carefully worded compromise, a masterpiece of bureaucratic face-saving. Sarah Jenkins was to be issued a formal letter of reprimand for her serious breach of protocol, which would be placed in her permanent file. She would also be required to complete a series of refresher courses on hospital policy and risk management. And, Effective immediately, her suspension was lifted. She was reinstated. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Dr. Finch was reportedly furious, his plan to make an example of her having backfired spectacularly. The story of his callous handling of the situation had been a central part of Ben Carter's reporting, and the hospital staff, emboldened by Sarah's stand, began to grumble. A few weeks later, facing a brewing internal revolt and pressure from the board of directors, Dr. Alistair Finch quietly tendered his resignation, citing personal reasons. The day Sarah returned to work was surreal. The walk through the hospital corridors was different now. The averted eyes were gone, replaced by nods of respect and quiet smiles. The nurses in the ER greeted her with a spontaneous round of applause. Her old supervisor, David Chen, approached her, his face etched with shame. "Sarah," he stammered, I'm sorry. I was wrong." She simply nodded, accepting the apology without malice. The ordeal had taught her to distinguish between malice and weakness. The most unexpected postscript came a week after her reinstatement. She was leaving the hospital after a long shift when she saw a familiar, imposing figure standing near the exit. General Marcus Thorne. He was out of uniform, dressed in a simple civilian polo shirt and slacks, which somehow made him seem both smaller and more human. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable as ever. She stopped a few feet from him, bracing herself. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice the same low baritone, but lacking its earlier edge of condescension. "General," she replied coolly. He was silent for a moment, as if wrestling with the words. "The board sent me their decision. A reprimand. It seems you've become something of a celebrity." There was no sarcasm in his tone, merely observation. "I just wanted to do my job," she said. He nodded slowly. "Sergeant Vance was moved out of the ICU yesterday. He's awake. He's talking. The doctors are optimistic about a full recovery." "I'm glad to hear that," she said, and she meant it. He looked away, his gaze settling on the distant city lights. "My world is one of order and protocol, Miss Jenkins. It has to be. In my world, unpredictable variables are threats. A person who breaks the rules, no matter how noble the reason, is a danger." He paused. "That's what I believed. It's what I was trained to believe." He turned back to face her, and his eyes held that same flicker she'd seen in the hearing room. "You were right about one thing, nurse," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. He was a man, I had lost sight of that. He didn't apologize. A man like Thorne wouldn't know how. But it was more than she ever expected. He gave her a stiff, final nod, turned, and walked away into the evening. The true moment of closure, however, came a month later. It was a quiet afternoon in the ER, a rare lull between crises. A young woman approached the nurse's station, pushing a man in a wheelchair. His leg was in a cast, and his arm was in a sling, but his eyes were clear and alert. Sarah looked up from her charting, and her breath caught. It was him. Sergeant Michael Vance. His wife, Elena, smiled at her, her eyes shining with tears. "We were just leaving his physical therapy session," she said. "Michael wanted to stop by." Sarah walked around the counter. She stood in front of the man whose life had become so inextricably linked with hers. He looked different in the light, younger than she'd imagined. He reached out with his good hand, and she took it. His grip was firm. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze conveying a depth of gratitude that no words could ever capture. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice a little hoarse but steady. "Thank you." It was all he said. It was all he needed to say. Sarah simply squeezed his hand and smiled. "You're welcome, Sergeant." Later that evening, as her shift ended, she stood for a moment by the large windows of the ER, looking out at the rain that had begun to fall again. The world outside was the same, but she was different. They had tried to break her, to grind her down with rules and threats. But they had failed. They hadn't understood that her strength didn't come from a policy manual. It came from the simple, unwavering conviction that a human life was worth more than a rule. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a survivor, a quiet hero who had faced down a system and won, not by fighting with its weapons, but by reminding it of the one thing it had forgotten, its own humanity. And she was ready for whatever came next.